Somewhere on the map, between two of the most dangerous and powerful waterways on Earth, a deal is being made. Not in a boardroom with cameras watching, not in a press conference with flags and handshakes and reporters asking questions. It is being made in sand, in steel, in cranes, in concrete, quietly, methodically, and with a patience the world keeps underestimating. And by the time most people realize what has happened, the ports will already be built, the contracts already signed, the cranes already standing, and China will already be standing at the gateway of the Arabian Gulf. Not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as the architect of everything you can see around you. This is not a story about war. It is not a story about missiles or soldiers or threats shouted across borders. This is a story far more powerful than any of that. This is a story about geography, about water, about the invisible lines that connect the oil beneath Saudi sand to the factories of Shanghai, and about who now controls the roads in between. Because when you control the port, you do not need to control the country. You already control everything that moves in and out of it. And right now, China controls more of Saudi Arabia's maritime infrastructure than most people on this planet have any idea about. Sit with that for a moment. Saudi Arabia, the kingdom that has supplied the world with its most essential resource for nearly a century, the country that has been America's most critical strategic partner in the Middle East for over 70 years, the nation that holds the two holiest cities in all of Islam and the world's second largest proven oil reserves, that country is quietly, systematically, and deliberately handing over the future of its ports to Beijing. Not out of desperation, not out of weakness, not out of ignorance, but out of a calculation so cold, so rational, and so forward-looking that it should make every geopolitical analyst on the planet stop whatever they are doing and pay full attention. To understand how this happened, and why it matters more than almost anything else unfolding in the world right now, you first have to understand where Saudi Arabia actually sits on the map. Because geography here is not background. Geography is not context. Geography is the entire story. Saudi Arabia is not landlocked. It is not a country sealed behind deserts with no outlet to the sea. It has two coastlines, two completely different coastlines facing two completely different bodies of water, and both of them are among the most strategically valuable stretches of water on Earth right now. On its western edge runs the Red Sea, over 1,800 kilometers of it, stretching from the Jordanian border in the north all the way down to Yemen in the south, where the Bab el-Mandeb Strait creates the narrow choke point that connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, then to the Indian Ocean, and then to the rest of the world. At its narrowest point, Bab el-Mandeb is only 29 kilometers wide. 29 kilometers between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, a passage so narrow you could almost shout across it. And through that gap flows roughly 12% of all global maritime trade every single year. Container ships, oil tankers, bulk carriers, military vessels, all funneling through this narrow throat, all visible to whoever sits on either shore and watches. On Saudi Arabia's eastern edge sits the Arabian Gulf, and at its southern end, the Strait of Hormuz. Hormuz is even more extreme in its strategic concentration. At its tightest point, ships must navigate a corridor of just 39 kilometers. Through that 39-kilometer passage flows approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply, 1/5 of global oil, every single day, moving through a gap barely wider than the distance most people drive to work. And every major industrial economy on Earth, Japan, South Korea, China, India, every European nation, depends on that oil moving freely through Hormuz. If that strait ever closes, if anything ever seriously disrupts the flow of traffic through it, the global economy does not slow down. It seizes, prices spike, supply chains break, governments panic. This is not a metaphor. This is the physical reality of where oil comes from and how it reaches the people who need it. These two coastlines are not just boundaries on a map. They are leverage. They are bargaining power in physical form. They are the geographic reality that makes Saudi Arabia not simply an oil state, but a geography state, a country positioned at the precise crossroads of the ancient and modern routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa all at once. Every container ship traveling from Asia to Europe saves roughly 2 full weeks of sailing time by taking the Red Sea route through the Suez Canal, rather than the alternative, going all the way around the southern tip of Africa. 2 weeks of fuel costs, 2 weeks of crew wages, 2 weeks of cargo sitting idle and generating nothing. The Red Sea route is not just convenient. It is economically essential to how global trade functions. And it runs alongside Saudi Arabia's western shore for its entire length. This is the geography that China studied. This is the geography China decided, very deliberately and over a very long period of time, to make itself indispensable to. And the method China chose is not force. It is a tool that is simultaneously more subtle and more permanent than force. It is infrastructure. Because infrastructure outlasts governments. Infrastructure outlasts diplomatic alliances. Infrastructure outlasts elections and revolutions and policy reversals. When you pour the concrete and you build the terminal and you install the systems, You own the relationship for the full operational lifetime of the structure, often 40, 50, 60 years. And Chinese concrete is now setting at port after port along the Saudi coastline, on both sides of the peninsula, from the Gulf of Aqaba in the northwest to the Arabian Gulf in the east. Start with Jeddah. Because if you want to understand what is actually happening here, Jeddah is where the story becomes undeniable. Jeddah Islamic Port is the single most important commercial port in Saudi Arabia. It handles roughly 65% of all Saudi container traffic. It is the primary gateway through which food enters the kingdom that imports over 80% of its food supply. It is the entry point for medicine, for electronics, for machinery, for consumer goods, for industrial inputs. Everything that Saudi Arabia's 35 million people consume that does not come from the ground. Most of it comes through Jeddah. And in 2024, when the kingdom issued the contract to build the next generation of Jeddah's container terminal, the winning bidder was China Harbor Engineering Company, a state-owned Chinese enterprise, a subsidiary of CCCC, China Communications Construction Company, one of the largest construction conglomerates on the face of this earth. China Harbor did not win a minor contract. They won the right to design, engineer, and construct the infrastructure that will define Jeddah's port capacity for the next 3 to 5 decades. In 2024, over $46 million was specifically invested in building Jeddah's first fully integrated port logistics system, covering 100,000 square meters of operational area and engineered to handle 300,000 additional containers every single year. That system is not just concrete and cranes. It runs on sensors, on software, on digital monitoring, on real-time data feeds. It generates an uninterrupted flow of commercial intelligence, cargo volumes, shipping schedules, vessel arrival windows, container classifications, trade patterns, and the company that built it is the company that understands it best, the company that maintains it, the company that updates it when the software needs patching, the company that answers the phone at 3 a.m. when something goes wrong. That company is Chinese. That dependency is now built into the architecture of the port itself. And Jeddah is not just a port. Jeddah is a city of over 4 million people, the commercial capital of Western Saudi Arabia, the cultural heartbeat of the Hejaz. It is the primary gateway for Hajj pilgrims arriving by sea and the logistics hub that feeds the western third of the kingdom. When you control what passes through Jeddah's port, when you know what is coming in, when it is arriving, what it costs, and where it is going, you hold a window into the economic pulse of everything around it. Every container logged, every vessel tracked, every shipping contract processed is a data point. And data points, accumulated over time at sufficient volume, become something more than logistics records. They become intelligence. They become economic leverage. And right now, that data is flowing through systems built by a company with full institutional knowledge of how every piece of the terminal operates. Move south. Keep moving down the Red Sea coast, past the heights of the Hejaz mountain range, past Mecca and Medina, past the fishing villages and the volcanic rock formations, all the way to the port city of Jazan, near the Yemeni border. Jazan has been one of Saudi Arabia's most ambitious industrial transformation experiments over the past 2 decades. A region that had little industrial infrastructure 20 years ago has been deliberately built into a special economic zone, a functioning industrial port city with refineries, petrochemical plants, power stations, and a deepwater port capable of handling international cargo. And at the center of that entire transformation, doing the physical work of making it real, was China Harbor Engineering, present since 2007. For 18 years, that is not a project engagement. That is a generational presence. Port construction, seabed dredging, land reclamation from the sea itself, water treatment infrastructure, pipeline installation, the total contract value of China Harbor's Saudi Arabia portfolio across Jazan, Ras Al Khair, Dammam, and associated projects reaches approximately $10 billion. $10 billion of Chinese-built Saudi maritime and industrial infrastructure. Every billion of that represents another decade of technical relationship, another layer of institutional knowledge that resides with the builder. But the most visionary and the most strategically significant story on the Red Sea is not Jeddah and not Jazan. The most important story is NEOM. And NEOM is something that requires a moment to fully absorb. NEOM is Saudi Arabia's $500 billion megacity project, the most expensive urban development in human history. A city being carved out of the desert and the mountains in the Tabuk region of northwestern Saudi Arabia, right where the Red Sea narrows toward the Gulf of Aqaba, right near the borders with Egypt and Jordan. A city that does not yet fully exist, being built at extraordinary scale in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, intended to eventually house 9 million people and function as a global hub for technology, tourism, green energy, and advanced manufacturing. Inside, NEOM is Oxagon, a floating industrial complex designed to become the largest of its kind on Earth, positioned precisely where the Red Sea approaches the Strait of Tiran. The Strait of Tiran controls the gateway between the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea proper. Whoever can monitor, service, or influence what moves through the Strait of Tiran has strategic eyes on one of the most sensitive maritime corridors connecting Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and the broader Red Sea. And inside Oxagon, there is a container terminal. The contract to build it, to design Container Terminal 1, to construct all the terminal buildings, all the port infrastructure, all the marine services facilities, was awarded to China Harbor Engineering Arabia, the same Chinese state company, again, NEOM's port, in the most strategically sensitive corner of the entire Red Sea, being built by a Chinese state enterprise, targeted to become operational in 2025. When it opens, China will have construction and engineering presence at the northern tip of the Red Sea, at the center of the Red Sea coast at Jeddah, and at the southern gateway near Bab el-Mandeb at Jazan, the full geographic range of Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coastline covered. What makes NEOM particularly significant beyond its size is its location. The Gulf of Aqaba, the body of water NEOM sits beside, is the only maritime access point for the port of Eilat in Israel and the port of Aqaba in Jordan. It connects to the Red Sea through the Strait of Tiran, which Egypt controls from Sinai and Saudi Arabia controls from the opposite shore. When Egypt and Israel signed their 1979 peace treaty, one of its most critical provisions was Egypt's guarantee of free passage through the Strait of Tiran for Israeli shipping. That strait is not just a Saudi concern. It sits at the intersection of Saudi, Israeli, Egyptian, and Jordanian interests, all of which have American security guarantees layered on top. And right next to that strait, on Saudi soil, China is now building NEOM's port. The physical proximity of Chinese-built infrastructure to one of the most diplomatically sensitive maritime choke points in the entire Middle East is a fact that has received almost no public attention. But it is a fact, and it will matter. Now cross to the eastern side, across the empty quarter, the Rub al-Khali, where there is no road and no water and no shade and no mercy, where the sand dunes reach 250 meters high and the summer temperatures are lethal. Come out the other side into the eastern province, the oil country. This is where the Aramco infrastructure begins. This is where the pipelines run and the refineries burn and the tankers load. Dammam, King Abdulaziz Port, Saudi Arabia's primary eastern maritime gateway, where industrial equipment enters, where petrochemical supply chains converge, where the kingdom's non-oil exports reach the Gulf waters. Here, too, a Chinese state enterprise is embedded. Power China, one of Beijing's most powerful energy and industrial construction companies, has completed major fabrication yards, shipyard assembly buildings, and platform construction facilities at King Abdulaziz Port. Chinese engineering, Chinese technical standards, Chinese institutional knowledge, installed at the most industrially critical port environment in the Arab world's largest economy. Draw that line. Draw it on a map. From Neom in the extreme northwest, down to Jeddah on the central Red Sea, down to Jazan at the southern Red Sea near the Yemeni frontier, then across the entire width of the Arabian Peninsula to Dammam on the Arabian Gulf. That line traces every major node of Saudi Arabia's maritime infrastructure. And at every single point on that line, a Chinese state company has built, is building, or holds the contract to build the defining infrastructure. That is not commerce. That is geographic strategy executed over 2 decades with extraordinary discipline and patience. Now, look at the numbers behind the map. In 2024, bilateral trade between China and Saudi Arabia reached $107.5 billion. That figure is nearly 3 times the value of American-Saudi trade in the same year, which totaled $39.5 billion. China is Saudi Arabia's #1 trading partner by an enormous margin. And that gap widens every year, because every port China builds increases the physical capacity for trade between the two countries, which grows the trade volume, which justifies the next port expansion, which produces the next construction contract, which goes to the same Chinese firms, which deepens the technical and financial relationship, which makes the next contract even easier to award to the same trusted partner. It is not a cycle. It is a compounding spiral. Between 2005 and mid-2024, China's total infrastructure investment in Saudi Arabia, ports, industrial zones, railways, energy projects, logistic systems, reached $85 billion. Nearly 60% of that, $45 billion, arrived after 2016, after Vision 2030 was announced, after the kingdom formally declared its intention to transform its economy at a scale and pace that required external partners with vast capital and proven construction capacity. China did not stumble into this opening. China had been preparing for exactly this kind of opening for 2 decades, building the state enterprises, the financing vehicles, the diplomatic relationships, and the technical reputation necessary to win when a country the size and wealth of Saudi Arabia finally said, "We are building and we need help." In 2023, China represented 58% of all new business investments flowing into Saudi Arabia. That is not a diversified investment picture. That is structural dominance by a single partner. And Saudi Investment Minister Khalid Al-Falih publicly stated that the time has come for China to become the principal investment partner in the Arab world's development drive. This was not said quietly or reluctantly. It was a declaration of strategic direction from the minister whose entire job is to shape the kingdom's investment future. He chose China. He said so out loud. And the contracts that followed made the words concrete, literally. In October 2024, the relationship added another layer. The KSA Sino-Logistics Zone was announced, a 4 square kilometer special commercial zone being developed at King Salman International Airport in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia's future mega airport, and the planned hub of its post-oil logistics ambitions. The zone is designed to bring in over 3,000 Chinese wholesalers and retailers and 200 Chinese light manufacturers to operate directly inside Saudi Arabia. This is not importing Chinese goods. This is embedding Chinese commercial operations inside Saudi infrastructure. It creates businesses with Saudi leases, Saudi employees, Saudi supply chain relationships. It creates a constituency. Thousands of Chinese companies with financial stakes inside the kingdom that will resist any political or diplomatic disruption of the relationship because disruption threatens their bottom line. It turns commercial presence into political inertia. And political inertia, sustained long enough, becomes structural reality. Now zoom all the way out. Because Saudi Arabia sits inside a much larger pattern that China has been building for over a decade across the entire Indian Ocean world. The Council on Foreign Relations tracks 129 global port projects where Chinese state entities hold ownership, management, or operational stakes. 115 are currently active. China has port presence on every continent except Antarctica. And the methodology is consistent enough to function almost like a playbook. Construction contract first. Chinese state enterprise wins the bid using state-backed financing that private competitors cannot match. Port gets built. Chinese engineers become the people who know the port best. Then comes the operational management contract. The same company or Chinese partner wins the right to run the terminal because who knows a port better than the company that built it? Now they control not just the physical infrastructure, but the data layer, shipping manifests, cargo types, vessel schedules, pricing flows. Then comes the digital integration, port management software, logistics coordination platforms, sensor networks, all running on Chinese technical systems connected to Chinese networks. LogInc is the name most people have never heard but need to understand. LogInc is a Chinese state-owned logistics data platform that at least 24 ports worldwide have already adopted. It is efficient. It integrates smoothly with Chinese shipping companies. It processes enormous volumes of logistics data in real time. But it operates on infrastructure owned and administered by the Chinese state. Every cargo manifest, every shipping route, every pricing decision, every container classification that passes through a LogInc-enabled port is potentially visible in Beijing. And in 2024, a congressional investigation in the United States found that communications equipment had been embedded inside Chinese manufactured cranes built by ZPMC, part of the same CCCC group building Saudi ports, that were installed at American ports. The equipment was not declared. It was not obviously visible. It was simply there, inside the machines, quietly collecting whatever it could collect. The same machines, the same companies, the same systems, now being installed along both coasts of Saudi Arabia. Consider what this means in operational terms. The Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf are the waters through which the United States projects naval power into the Middle East. American aircraft carrier strike groups transit these waters. American military logistics flow through these lanes. American intelligence operations depend on understanding what moves through these corridors. And now the ports alongside those corridors, the ports where ships are tracked, logged, refueled, and serviced, are being built by Chinese state enterprises using Chinese software and Chinese sensor networks. You do not need a listening post on the shore if your port management platform is already processing every vessel movement in the harbor. And consider an even more alarming geographic reality. Iran, which sits on the eastern shore of the Arabian Gulf and shares sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz with Oman, signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with China in 2021. Under that deal, China committed to investing up to $400 billion into Iran's economy over 25 years, in exchange for discounted oil supplies and strategic access to Iranian infrastructure. That agreement covers ports, railways, telecommunications, energy facilities, and banking networks across Iran, which means China is simultaneously embedded in Saudi port infrastructure on the western shore of the Arabian Gulf and in Iranian infrastructure on the eastern shore. The two countries that face each other across the Strait of Hormuz, the passage through which 20% of global oil moves every day, both have Chinese state enterprises embedded in their port systems. Beijing is, in the most literal geographic sense, positioned on both sides of the most critical energy choke point on Earth. No military alliance, no treaty, No deployment of forces has ever achieved that kind of positional advantage in the Gulf. China achieved it through construction contracts. Saudi Arabia is not blind to this tension. Mohammed bin Salman is not naive. The kingdom's decision-makers understand exactly what they are inviting in. They are making a deliberate strategic bet, the bet of a country that has watched American commitment to the region grow inconsistent, that saw Washington become energy independent through shale and therefore less materially dependent on Gulf stability, that watched the confused American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the contradictory signals around Iran, the conditional and politically contested nature of American security guarantees. Saudi leadership processed all of that and reached a conclusion. Diversify. Not abandon Washington. American weapons systems, American security frameworks, and the American consumer market still matter enormously. But build enough strategic depth with Beijing that the kingdom is never again exclusively dependent on a single patron whose domestic politics can suddenly make the relationship unreliable. This is rational. It is also dangerous. Because every layer of Chinese infrastructure embedded in Saudi Arabia is a layer that becomes harder to remove without disrupting the economic functions that depend on it. The cost of decoupling rises with every contract, with every system installed, with every Chinese company that establishes logistics operations inside the kingdom. What begins as strategic hedging, sustained over a decade, starts to look structurally indistinguishable from strategic alignment. The line between the two is real, but it grows harder to see the longer the current trajectory continues. America's response has been inadequate. American officials have raised concerns privately and in some congressional hearings. There have been diplomatic conversations with Riyadh about the risks of Chinese companies embedding too deeply in critical infrastructure. But those conversations have not translated into a competing offer. China's Belt and Road Initiative has deployed over $1 trillion globally since 2013. The United States answered with the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, $600 billion pledged across all developing economies over 6 years. And Saudi Arabia, as a wealthy Gulf state, is not a primary target of that program. The gap between what China is doing in Saudi Arabia and what America is willing and able to match is not closing. Every year it stays open is a year of further Chinese construction, further Chinese integration, further Chinese positioning along the most strategically important coastlines in the world. Part of the problem is structural. American infrastructure investment works through private capital markets, development banks, and public-private partnerships that move at the speed of commercial risk assessment. Chinese infrastructure investment works through state command. A decision made in Beijing translates into capital deployed within months, backed by balance sheets that absorb geopolitical risk and work on timelines measured in decades rather than quarterly earnings cycles. Saudi Arabia offered a window of opportunity that required speed, scale, and willingness to absorb early-stage uncertainty. Private American capital was not built to move that way. Chinese state capital was built for exactly that, and the result is visible in every crane standing along the Red Sea coast. There is also a political dimension that no diplomatic conversation has yet resolved. Saudi Arabia watched the United States impose conditions on weapons sales in 2022 and 2023 related to the Yemen conflict. It watched Washington publicly criticize the Khashoggi killing and impose targeted sanctions. It watched American political debates that treated Gulf monarchies as liabilities rather than partners. Every one of those moments was a reminder that the American relationship carries political overhead, that the Chinese relationship, at least so far, does not. China does not publicly comment on Saudi domestic governance. China does not condition infrastructure contracts on human rights benchmarks. China does not have a domestic political constituency that periodically turns Saudi Arabia into a campaign issue. For a kingdom that prizes stability and sovereignty above almost everything else, that kind of unconditional partnership has enormous practical appeal. In 10 years, if this trajectory holds, the physical infrastructure of Saudi Arabia's entire maritime frontier will have been largely designed, built, and in many cases operated by Chinese state enterprises. The cranes will be Chinese manufactured. The port operating systems will run on Chinese software. The logistics data will flow through Chinese digital platforms. The engineers who understand the systems best will have been trained by Chinese companies or worked alongside them for years. The maintenance contracts will require Chinese-sourced components. The technical knowledge of how Saudi Arabia's ports actually work, at the deepest operational level, will reside with the companies that built them. And those companies report to Beijing. The ships will still fly Saudi flags. The ports will still carry Saudi names. Jeddah Islamic Port, King Abdulaziz Port, the Jazan Commercial Port, the Neom Container Terminal. They will be Saudi by sovereignty, by law, by official designation, by the language on every sign. But sovereignty and control are not the same thing. Sovereignty is what is written in the Constitution. Control is who holds the technical knowledge. Control is who answers the phone when the port management system fails. Control is who processes the data, who maintains the cranes, who builds the next expansion. And the answer to each of those questions, increasingly and with each passing year more definitively, is Beijing. This is the story that no single headline has managed to fully explain, because it does not announce itself. There is no invasion to report, no ultimatum to reject, no crisis to broadcast live. There is only a construction contract announced in a trade publication that nobody reads outside the industry. Then another 8 months later. Then a logistics zone mentioned in a ministerial communiqué. Then an investment total buried in the footnotes of a bilateral summit readout. Individually, each piece looks like normal development cooperation. Together, assembled on a map, connected across 15 years, measured in total dollars and total kilometers of coastline and total terabytes of logistics data, they form a picture that is anything but normal. The picture is of a country that has patiently, with extraordinary geographic intelligence and long-range strategic clarity, embedded itself as the indispensable builder, operator, and data processor of the infrastructure that connects the world's most energy-critical region to the global economy. China did not seize Saudi Arabia's ports. There was no seizure. Saudi Arabia invited China to build them. The invitation was freely given. The contracts were fairly won. The trade flows are genuinely mutual. But the concrete, once poured, does not come back out. The systems once installed do not simply switch off. And the knowledge, once transferred, does not simply disappear. The geography, the quiet, patient, permanent geography, shifts with every crane that goes up and every terminal that opens. The ancient Silk Road was China's first great attempt to connect its economy to the wider world through trade routes that Chinese merchants navigated. The Belt and Road Initiative is the 21st century version of that ambition, bigger, more systematic, and backed by the full industrial and financial capacity of an economy generating nearly $18 trillion of output per year. And at the geographic heart of its maritime Silk Road, at the most critical arc of its entire global port network, sits the Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea, the Arabian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia. What is most striking about China's approach is not its aggression, it is its restraint. China has not made demands. It has not issued ultimatums. It has not put a warship in the Red Sea and called it an exercise of influence. It has sent engineers. It has sent construction companies. It has sent capital with long repayment schedules and no political strings attached. And in doing so, it has made itself the most useful partner the kingdom has ever had for the specific thing the kingdom needs right now: physical transformation. The building of a new Saudi Arabia. China showed up with exactly the right tool for that moment, at exactly the right time, at a scale no other country was willing or able to match. And the result is written in concrete across 2,000 kilometers of the most geopolitically critical coastline on Earth. The cranes are still moving. The contracts keep arriving. The concrete keeps setting. And one by one, port by port, contract by contract, kilometer by kilometer of the most strategically vital coastline on Earth, the geography of the future is being written in a language most of the world has not yet learned to read, and in a hand that belongs unmistakably to Beijing.